told you, Rose, and today we're going to be discussing a work called Philosophy and Art, which was inspired by a Voicecraft Freeform session. And here we're going to be talking about the complicated relationship between philosophy and art. And the work has a number of points, but I'm just going to focus on the opening section, which is inspired by a paper by Patrick G. Lake discussing Plato. And we all know the famous story about how Plato exiles the poets from out of the Republic. But what's interesting, Dr. Lake points out, is that Socrates doesn't kick out just artists in general. He kicks out artists that cannot be fit into a philosophical project. And it's very interesting because when Plato, and actually we should make distinctions between Plato and Socrates, which of course is funny because, Plato wrote the Republic, but everything that's in the mouth of Socrates, so it becomes a question of what did Plato say versus what did Socrates says. But, Socrates seems to be okay with Homer and refers to Homer being a great teacher, but Homer was a poet. Now, Dr. Lake turns out, to quote Dr. Lake, he'll say, Plato turns Homer into a useful source of the training of the state's leaders and subjects by philosophically revising his poetry, citing the bard's words in philosophic context in such a way that they support philosophical aims, values, and positions. Now, Plato, Socrates will go about even just straight up censoring Homer to accomplish this goal. But it's really important to note also that Socrates seems to think that Homer plays an essential role in the education of the philosopher king, which, if that's true, quickly complexifies this idea that Socrates is just simply against all poets in general, and we can elaborate that to being all artists. So it seems to me that what Socrates is against is artists that don't fit into a philosophical project. If art helps, if it has philosophical aims, then it is acceptable. And maybe a way to think about this is the difference between, to use language we'd use today, the difference between entertainment and art. And it could be the case that in Plato's day they didn't have this hard distinction, so art and entertainment just kind of blurred together. I think all of us know there's a difference between binging on some kind of soap operas on television and, say, watching Persona or some of the classical films, Citizen Kane or things like that these are not equivalent. Now, we have to be careful before we talk about high art and low art, because, Derrida deconstructs that dichotomy, even though I think there's some truth to it. But generally speaking, we all understand there's difference between mere entertainment and art. That kind of seems to be actually what Plato is saying, that he doesn't want to allow mere entertainment into the Republic. He wants there to be, if there is art, if there is poetry, plays, paintings, and so on and so forth, that they have to have meaning. They have to be part of a bigger picture. And I think we can actually, in this, maybe see people like Adorno, who warns about consumer capitalism. We can see some of the warnings that we have about entertainment that becomes raw consumerism, distraction, keeping us from the bigger questions, from doing something with our lives. And I think if we understand that that is what Plato is opposing, then we can start to understand that the Republic doesn't have to be entirely devoid of art. Now, Plato is certainly concerned about the making of shadows from shadows that art can contribute to, that keeps us from what we really need to focus on. But if indeed Homer can be allowed, then we need to be careful before we think that Plato is against all arts. In fact, Dr. Lake makes the funny point that Socrates kind of says, hey, if anyone can bring me a poet, if anyone can object to my exiling of the poets, well, come on, show me, prove me wrong. And in some respects, Plato himself is the response to Socrates. That Plato's a great writer. Plato is very poetic. That the very writings and work of Plato are themselves examples of the poetic project that Socrates would allow into his Republic. So I think that's a very nice turn that Dr. Lake explores. I think another way to think about this is that we have to remember that in the allegory of the cave, that the prisoners, they're tied and they're watching these shadows on the wall. Now, often people talk about puppets on the wall, and maybe in some translations that's valid, but really it's described as there's a wall that is like the curtain a puppeteer uses, and that there are these shadows cast upon it from people walking and bustling about, almost like a market scene. It would seem that Plato is aware that some art can function like the shadows in that wall, and so he wants us to avoid that kind of art, and instead focus to art that's found in Homer. But what's really critical is if, in fact, Homer is essential to the education of the philosopher king, then that would suggest that there's some kind of art that is part of the process that makes someone walk out of the cave. Well, if that's the case, then far from art being completely problematic, it may be part of what leads to enlightenment, that leads to finding the truth. We often just think of the people in the cave as being stupid and the philosopher king as being smart, and that's the difference. But the prisoners are playing that game where they have to memorize the order of shapes, and that's not exactly easy. They actually show intellect. They're not stupid. The problem is that they're not rightly applying their intellect. They're applying it to a silly memorization game that, if you went to the upper world, you'd realize what a waste of time that memorization game was. So it's not that the prisoners are stupid, it's that they're not applying their intellect toward the right end. And you see, what I would argue is that art and aesthetic thinking and which can be associated with an experience and imagination, are precisely what expands the range of rationality and philosophical thought. That if you don't have imagination, the great irony is that philosophy can keep you in a cave, precisely because you cannot not imagine leaving the cave. So what does the philosopher king do? He doesn't think about an upper world. He leaves the cave. He does something in experience, something in the realm of the aesthetic. He walks out of the cave, and because he does that, he is introduced to new thinking. But if all he ever did was think, as arguably that's the problem with the prisoners, all they do is think this game of memorization, then you can't escape the cave. If this is true, then the aesthetic is precisely necessary for the expansion of the rational, so that the rational does not create a cave that it puts itself in and cannot escape. Rationality can create the cave. Philosophy, in a way, can be what creates the cave that we then sit down in and never leave, where the aesthetic can help us leave it. Another way to put this is to just use the phrase I always talk about, the true isn't the rational, which is the idea that what's true organizes what's rational. If I think it's going to rain today, it becomes rational to bring an umbrella. But let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean I was irrational? No. It means I was rational and wrong. So what we think is rational is relative to what we believe is true. And as hopefully the paper makes clear, we can associate truth with the aesthetic and philosophy with rationality. Well, that would mean that it is the aesthetic against which we determine the rational, and the range of the aesthetic will also organize the range of the rational. And if we aren't constantly expanding our aesthetic vision, then our rationality will be trapped and it won't expand as well. So therefore, the aesthetic, far from being what we should exile from the Republic, comes to play a necessary role in making it possible for the Republic to determine truth. And if it cannot determine truth, then rationality is going to keep people inside of caves. Rationality alone doesn't help us leave the cave. Rationality secures us in our bondage within it. So this is all to say that for a very long time, we've asked the question, and this is what Plato presents. Socrates is basically suggesting that art can only be allowed in the Republic that fits into a philosophical project. And certainly that there's validity to that. But what we also need to ask is, does philosophy fit into an aesthetic vision? For too long, we've given all the emphasis to philosophy and making art prove itself worthy of philosophy. Well, we need to start asking if philosophy proves itself worthy of art. We need to ask the question the other way around, because if we do not, then philosophy will not lead to us escaping the cave. It will keep us within it. For a long time, people have asked the question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And here we ask, what does philosophy have to do with art? The answer seems to be everything. For we cannot imagine if we cannot think, but at the same time, we cannot think what we cannot imagine. Anyway, this has been OG Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.